The discussion of Nietzsche's politics has never really satisfied me. On the one hand, there are those who brashly accept Nietzsche's political philosophy wholeheartedly and treat anything short of aristocratic radicalism as a sort of betrayal or softening of Nietzsche's philosophical vision. Those would be the types of people who often criticize folks like Walter Kaufmann. And on the other hand, there are those with basically every other political opinion under the sun, other than that of Nietzsche's, whether it be socialism or liberal democracy or libertarianism or some other ideology, who will either prove the aristocratic radicals right by trying to falsify Nietzsche's beliefs and misconstrue him as something that he was not, like a humanist, or else they'll argue that Nietzsche's political philosophy doesn't matter, that it's the least important part of his philosophy, and we should just ignore it. Neither of these viewpoints work for me, and it's taken me probably up until now to find the words to explain why. It may be tempting to divide these people into left and right wing, or to divide them according to psychological temperament, but there's something else here that I think is fairly important. These two camps correspond to the two sides of the apparently paradoxical and oxymoronic totality of Nietzsche's philosophy, and that Nietzsche attacks all morals as human projections onto the world, and thus completely perspectival, expressing values which are relative and specific to a given time, place, and circumstance. And yet Nietzsche also dares to explain the world through the notion of will to power, and therefore describe the intelligible character of all life and accordingly come to a value system of his own. He understands that all values are relative, and yet Nietzsche feels the need to assert one, and not even in spite of the fact of its absolute relativity, but almost because of it, because it's the very demand of living and of will to power, to assert what we value as something truly and undeniably of value, something which we will fight and even die for. And so I think sometimes the perspectival element of Nietzsche is liable to be dismissed by those who treat the will to power and the Overman as Nietzsche's central message. And meanwhile, Nietzsche's revaluation of values, with its new morality based on will to power and the legend of the Overman, is rather easily dismissed out of hand by the person who finds Nietzsche's perspectivism as his more relevant project to them. Because these two approaches to Nietzsche's philosophy of prioritizing one side or the other of his thought says more about the person reading Nietzsche than it does about Nietzsche and his whole project, I think we need to attempt to make sense of the whole picture in order to move forward here. It's more interesting to me to understand why it was that Nietzsche has this paradoxical character to his philosophy. In some sense, from the very beginning of his career in Birth of Tragedy, up to his most celebrated works like Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche is interested in collapsing opposite categories and demonstrating that where we see an opposite, it's never a matter of mutually opposed essences, but rather gradations, and that one apparent opposite can give rise to the other, that truth rests on a foundation of ignorance, that grace and virtue and love could spring from vice and brutality and hatred. This is true in regards to these two concepts that I bring up at the beginning, by which one could interpret politics through the Nietzschean lens. The will to power actually gives rise to Nietzsche's perspectivism, and vice versa, insofar as the will to power, when taken as a world explanation, leaves one with a view of the world which is not a reality guided by a moral end. There's no goal in the processes of history. This means that the world is a competing battleground of phenomena which are wholly individual, each their own quantum of will force, attempting to exercise their will upon the world. Each acts based upon what they are and where they are, their vantage point. This has dire ramifications for the idea of universal truth. And that's, ironically enough, the means by which the modern cultural right often pushes against what they call postmodernism, often while invoking Nietzsche himself in their arguments, and yet it comes straight out of Nietzsche. There are no universal truths at all, only the perspectives of battling groups, or more precisely, battling individuals. Even truths that may seem universal to everyone may only be universal to humankind. There may be truths that exist because of who and what we are as human beings. In other words, truth is no longer conceived as an objective fact to be discovered, but something that exists at the intersection of the phenomenal world with our sense perceptions. Truth is contingent. That's another way of putting it. And so we have a multiplicity of differing perspectives and no objective standard by which to say that one or the other is correct. And so the very notion of the world as will to power in its fullest expression means the abolition of absolute truth. And yet, as we all know, Nietzsche affected his revaluation of values by, in some sense, making power the absolute truth. At the very point of abolishing this universal perspective, we discover that there is, in fact, nothing other than the inarguable fact of our deepest desires, of our most powerful impulses, our conceptions of what is sacred and what is valuable to us, that we would rather will nothingness than not to will at all. And thus, even though the universal objective basis of valuing has been laid aside, we discover that it has nothing to do with whether we will go on valuing or not. We are valuing creatures. Man, Mensch, is the measure of all things. That's what we do. We will, we value. And so our mistake was believing in the universality or objectivity of our values or of our worldview. The mistake was not in having values or in employing a worldview for the purposes of navigating this world. In fact, it's a mistake to try and live without values. And we find that we cannot really do without them even if we tried. And so with this more complete perspective, I think we can now ask ourselves, what was it that Nietzsche was doing in writing his political remarks in relation to his broader philosophical project? Politics is always a bit of a sideline for Nietzsche. It's a topic that laces his whole work while almost never being itself the focus. Insofar as he even takes the time to write about politics or make statements which are relevant to political philosophy, his project is not to create a new political system or to improve the existing ones. It's unclear how one might even go about implementing such a suite of ideas, since radically changing society would seem to go against Nietzsche's approach. And Nietzsche therefore makes it implicitly clear that his intention is to wage a cultural war through his philosophical influence by seducing people over to the morality of will to power, which will then lead them into the embrace of aristocratic political beliefs. And he can't outline any type of political system because the right people need to be in power. And therefore the details of the system are not of terrible importance because it's always people who rule and not laws in some sort of abstract sense. Nietzsche's political ideas are therefore counter-revolutionary. From the time of Human All Too Human, when he raged against the inflamed passions brought about by Rousseau and remarked of the revolutionary spirit, crush the damn thing, all the way to his mature period where he fully embraces this cyclical worldview in which there's no possibility of social, moral, or political progress, Nietzsche, throughout this whole time, even as there are these subtle changes, he is always against implementing one's ideals to attempt to alter or improve mankind and create a paradise on earth. It's always a mistake because human beings need conflict and suffering. If we are removed from suffering, we create it for ourselves. And if we succeed in avoiding it for too long, we become incompetent and fragile. Life is this war, this stress, this tension, and any attempt to unbend the bow and deliver us from this tension are folly for that very reason. It's another secret path to nothingness. So what then could Nietzsche's goal be? What is it that his politics expresses? What is the message behind his politics, so to speak? And personally, I think this message has nothing to do with whether you want to live under an aristocracy or whether Nietzsche would support socialism or not, or whatever other debates we want to have, and which we will go on having, because really we're just trying to satisfy our lust for combat by whatever means we can, and debating each other is one of those means. What Nietzsche expresses in his politics is a sentiment common to much of Nietzsche's writing. And perhaps oddly enough, given the aristocratic radicalism of Nietzsche's political views, that sentiment is freedom. What we mean by freedom here is not freedom as we usually conceive of it in the political sense. It's free-spiritedness, as Nietzsche coins it, which involves the ability to come to conclusions without the external pressures of society and culture, to escape from those pressures, and thus to arrive at the unity of one's actions and their desires, where one's will and one's character are aligned. In the political sphere, what Nietzsche is doing when he invokes realism and when he combats morality as anti-nature is attempting to express morality as nature, which is almost a sort of contradiction in terms. And it's why I think there are these delightful little contradictory elements that I think will beguile readers of Nietzsche for all time, because he's attempting to do something to express nature through morality, and in some sense, at least the way we've been getting morality served to us for the past several thousand years, morality is almost always anti-natural in its very character. But what his project aims at, Nietzsche's project, in the highest sense, is for us to have an honest self-conception of who and what we are, and what drives our actions. Consequently, he wants us to have an honest conception of what the state is, what the political life is, that it is a power struggle, and that these philosophical conceptions of what the state is, and of rights and sovereignty and even justice, are fictions. So, rather than a revolutionary project aimed at reimagining what the state could be, Nietzsche's, in some sense, saying, let me tell you what the state really is. His war against moralism is a war against all of these abstract, idealistic notions that we all have in our brain and that are preventing us from being free, which is to say, from doing what all life forms naturally do, which is to express their particular pattern of being, to assert it against all odds and against all other patterns or forms that might oppose us. And so I think construing Nietzsche's perspectivism into a total political nihilism would be incorrect, just as reifying will to power into a tenet of an orthodox Nietzschean philosophy, based on this aristocratic radicalist model that Nietzsche himself was in favor of. Neither is accurate because both are still within the moral world of prescriptive statements, so long as you're saying you have to come to this conclusion if you read Nietzsche. And the number of people in the comment sections who think they understand Nietzsche but still either explicitly or implicitly invoke prescriptive statements would shock you. Or perhaps it wouldn't shock you. But treating Nietzsche as if what he wants to do is leave us with imperatives. Moral imperatives are something Nietzsche has a good laugh at. So he is indeed waging a cultural war, but not even with the aim of convincing you to act differently than you already would, according to who you are. Nor is his goal to fight for a given political outcome, because Nietzsche doesn't believe that anything he writes can change the facts of nature, can change the war of all against all. You are all engaged in it right now, whether you acknowledge it or not. The side with the most force will always triumph, and thus the outcome of every contest is in some sense already decided. And yet the renewed conflict is assured and ever recurring, because even if it sometimes seems like the conflict is settled, it always returns. So Nietzsche's task is to get us to understand our situation within that world honestly, to be able to recognize what it is that we're doing and why. And then from there, who would Nietzsche be to tell you not to fight for what it is that you value? Who would he be to tell you not to fight for what would benefit or elevate you or advance you in the particular way of life that you manifest, the way of life that you fight for? Nietzsche's task is not to legislate for us. It's to teach us to be self-legislators, to give us the permission to undertake this task. Because we have, for so many centuries, been told that it is a sin. It is evil, it is immoral to dare to be a self-legislator in the domain of morality. You should listen to the voice of your conscience and don't get any of those big ideas. We have misunderstood morality more completely than anything else about the human condition because it's so close to our hearts. It's something so close that we can't see it, so all-pervasive that we can't see it. Because of the very illusion that morality is not something objective in the world, but something from our perspective that is painted onto the world. It's because of that illusion that we have been ignorant up until very recently in human history of the fact that we can actually change our valuations. This is not by means of arbitrary acts of will, nor by rational deliberation, however. These revaluations of value on the societal level happen at the great turning points of human history. They happen out of a deep necessity, and they're driven by 1,000 factors seen and unseen, such that we can say our evaluations on the societal level and on the individual level are something that evolved. It is a process so slow, so gradual, that the transformation is hardly perceptible. And because what we hold sacred we tend not to question, we always imagine that what we value dropped out of the lap of being as an eternal truth. Now, we reach a juncture where we have gained the vantage point in order to comprehend morality for what it is. We have reached the age of comparisons where the previous dogmas have become questioned to death, a million new ideas and superstitions have come into being, the social consensus has begun to dissolve, and anything is possible. This is just as Luther made every man his own priest. The Renaissance was its own revaluation of values, then the Protestant Reformation was another. The Enlightenment represented a further turn in human knowledge and perspective towards the scientific worldview, and the Romantic reaction against the Enlightenment was another tectonic shift in the European mind. Nietzsche arrives at the end of the 19th century, where he foresees the transformation of Europe into this materialist world where man is nothing but an animal ruled by his impulses, where the historical turn brought about by Hegel and the new evolutionary understanding brought forward by Darwin would progress us beyond the sentimentality of Rousseau or the deontological excesses of Kant or even the resignationism of Schopenhauer. He predicted that the questions of value and the crisis of nihilism would become so serious in the 20th century that a new age of war and militarism would arise, and that is certainly what happened. But what comes after this? After the industrial, analytical, technologically advanced world that emerged from the greatest conflicts that the world had ever seen and into this long peace, a world dominated by increasingly complex systems of managerial bureaucracy, neoliberal systems of trade, finance, and debt, and a relatively safe, peaceful, and abundant living situation for the privileged few, maintained by a powerful new system of surveillance and law enforcement. The democratization of knowledge on a scale that Luther couldn't have imagined, no doubt sowing the seeds for more free spirits than ever before, but bringing with it more degradation of human knowledge, more farce and spectacle. The internet in that respect is worse than any newspaper of Nietzsche's day could ever hope to be, right? One could quite possibly have imagined such an era coming about as a reaction to the resurgence of militarism that was represented by the early 20th century. Just as you see this romantic reaction against the scientific enlightenment, you see this reaction of peace against the terrible world wars. But that long peace places us into a new set of conditions, which are not approximated by Nietzsche's day, however many parallels one may see with our time and his, and however similar it may seem to our modern times when compared with, say, the life of an ancient Greek. It may be a cliche at this point, but there's that old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And perhaps that's as good a summary as any for explaining how I feel about all of this, where I assess where we are now and compare it to the problems and challenges of Nietzsche's time, the cultural and moral problems that he was trying to solve. In his untimely analysis of society and culture, Nietzsche always subtly reminds us of how we're facing the same problems in the history of humanity, and we're always living out the same drama. There's always a mob of people with what we might call Christian sentiments. There are always those obsessed with their national character or absorbed with an identity as a class revolutionary, the mass person. The social order is always delegitimizing itself, and the traditional ideas are always losing their luster. And hopefully for us, in these times of greatest dissolution and chaos, the greatest range of possibilities exists for change and transformation. So I do not know what I should call the current age, whether it should be considered a technocratic age or a managerial age. Perhaps the common term, the information age, is good enough because that certainly defines it quite accurately. We're overwhelmed with information. But as to defining it, I don't know if we can determine its like archetypal figure at the moment, since usually that's something that's best done in hindsight. Nietzsche often finds these archetypal thinkers or political figures to define an age. People like Schopenhauer, Goethe, Napoleon, Kant, Rousseau, the figures we discussed in detail last week. But again, I don't think we're too close to the age to be able to find who those people really are. I'm sure that in the history books, a handful of social media personalities who are around today will be among the vanguard. As Hans-Georg Müller has argued, we seem to have entered an age of profilicity, where one's profile, their public-facing persona, crafted to appeal to the greatest many, defines who and what we are. We're steadily moving on from the model of authenticity and instead creating our identity as part of the spectacle, created by the greatest exchange of information the world has ever seen. Maybe we could even call it the profilicity age. This is what we find new about this era, though, that there are conditions that we find nowhere before in human history, brought about by technology. The same patterns reemerge insofar as oligarchy returns even now, even within the context of democracy. War is always waged, even if it is waged by more sophisticated means. The internal social conflict is here with us, even as it is more subtle than ever. And we find that the crisis of values has not abated. It's remained with us as well, as secularism promises to deliver us into an age with no orthodoxy whatsoever. The death of God, scarcely even perceived in Nietzsche's time, has now become fairly obvious to a large portion of the populace, and more are becoming awakened to this fact every day. For decades, many of us have maintained the rather naive answer to this fundamental challenge in question in Nietzsche's philosophy, that we can simply live without any kind of higher ideal. We can live without any kind of sacred values. But we are fast realizing that this is a complete disconnection between our words and our actions. It's unfree in that way, right? The struggle over values continues even if we make the pretense of not taking part in it, because our values are always expressed in our actions and, in some sense, implied by our actions. And so, in spite of the profound technological changes that do actually potentially put us into a new situation, a novel situation that no one has ever faced before. And you could argue that, in some sense, this is always the case, even as we see this like eternally recurring cycle within history. Nietzsche's suggestions or his words of wisdom for us, I think, are still relevant. His suggestions to us might be to ignore the words of politicians, to appraise them by their actions, and to appraise the state by its actions, by the results that are created by the process rather than the ideals that are expressed. Never to attribute a benign incompetence to what can be easily explained by the will to power. That's the reverse of the common Reddit wisdom, right? That you should never attribute to malice what can be explained by ignorance or incompetence. Nietzsche would say quite the opposite. Sure, people are plenty incompetent and ignorant and all of these things, but will to power is always what's driving people. They're always self-interested and motivated by seeking after their own values and what will expand their own power and their own ability to acquire more power. So attributing everything to simple incompetence when the will to power will always see you get duped. And we should also always remember, according to Nietzsche, that weakness corrupts. Indeed, he inverts that old British aphorism, because he doesn't see power in itself as evil. Power is a reality of human life. It's the essence of life. To swear off the seeking of power is morality as anti-nature. So to accomplish anything in the world, we have to exercise power. And it's only when people who gain power are the types of people who are bitter, resentful, hateful, or vindictive that we have cause to call power bad. Everything good that we want to do in the world, we need power to do it. And so it's the slave morality of the person in question wielding the power that ought to be challenged, and not power itself. In other words, Nietzsche's descriptive account of political power and the origins of the state and so on can be useful to us even in the completely new situation of the 21st century. But there is a power to Nietzsche's political analysis beyond this, pun intended. And to explain what I mean, we'll use an example. Suppose we wish to challenge Nietzsche on his assertion that all human motivation is will to power. Suppose we wish to claim that the state or a political party can function based on driving principles that are outside of power entirely. From there, the question arises, what is it that is outside of power? What principle exists which can be said to form up an altogether foreign motivation from the expression of power or the seeking of power? So, for example, one potential answer might be love. It's a very Christian answer, but it must be said, we don't have to conceive of love in the type of, universalist Christian sense. We might simply note that human beings place an intense value on their familial relationships, and that those with whom they have close bonds, by blood or just by friendship even in many cases, that's the most important thing in the world to human beings, above any material or political accomplishment, above money or power or anything of that kind. It is not at all surprising to us to hear of people who will die for their loved ones. Now, Nietzsche would argue that love has been one of the most overestimated motives of human behavior. He would challenge the assertion that love is part of the revealed character of life, supposing we were to try and substitute it for the will to power. Because what do we see in the animal kingdom? We see the cipo matador. We see parasitism, life feeding on itself, organisms battling for control of territory or ecosystems, and so on. Love is important to us as human beings because of what we are. We are social animals. Nietzsche might say herd animals. But I think Nietzsche could rather comfortably subsume love beneath the broader impulse patterned by will to power. That love is this emergent property of the human social reality, and that social reality was a way of the greatest many of preserving themselves against the war of all against all in nature, and therefore love is just simply something instrumental. It's not a fundamental driving force. But on the other hand, we could appeal to the speech of Diotima in Plato's Symposium, the high priestess of Eros that Socrates cites, and her conception of Eros that she gives. What love is, in the highest sense, might be represented by that willingness of any organism to fight to the death, the weaker against the stronger, for the sake of its offspring. That this is the expression of its love. What this indicates to Diotima is that love is an expression of the seeking of eternity, the seeking of eternal life. Unlike the gods, we don't endure as immortals, remaining the same forever, but die and are reborn in our offspring, the recipients of our love. We would die for our offspring because the purpose of life is to overcome itself and give rise to something beyond itself, and therefore to love our children is to aim at this process of self-overcoming through which we achieve eternity. And so perhaps we could reconceive of love in some way that makes it more all-encompassing so that it could perhaps rival the will to power as an explanation for the intelligible character of all life. But notice where we end up in that analysis. I mean, we've had to say that love is self-overcoming. Remember how Nietzsche defines will to power. He practically defines it by self-overcoming. Nietzsche is able to then conflate the concept of love under the banner of will to power as an expression of it. That is the power of the will to power idea, right? It's very flexible, and there is something so fundamental about self-overcoming that Nietzsche discovers in the character of life. Meanwhile, if the concept of love as something beyond will to power is to truly escape from that notion, in my view, it almost has to take the form that I earlier referenced as the Christian form of love, as this universal, almost cosmic sense of love, the love of all things, right? Love must exist within the very fabric of the universe and be in some sense the rule of the universe. And that explanation requires us, in some sense, to just deny the reality that we see in front of our eyes, to say that the world in which the parasitism of the cipo matador is the rule is in some sense governed by love, but it must be in a way that is unseen, that the world as it appears is somehow faulty or cursed or it's self-contingent, that a true world exists upon which our revealed sensory world of phenomena is only dependent. And so my point in raising this thought experiment of what we could look for outside of the will to power as an explanation for the character of life in the world is not to argue for Nietzsche's will to power or against Christian love. What is important is not that we decide whether Nietzsche was correct and whether will to power ought to be the overarching idea by which we analyze the human condition, or whether some other principle could be included or even substituted for Nietzsche's formulation. The point is for each of us to bring before our mind that question, the question of how we will determine what values are to guide us. If we are to accept Nietzsche's will to power, then what does that entail for us in the political realm? What kinds of political projects are possible and which ones must be dismissed as folly? And on what basis do we accept what Nietzsche is saying about the will to power if the situation has changed so drastically in the 100 years, in the great changes in history that have gone by since he wrote his books? And if we don't then accept the will to power framework at all, then why not? What can we explain the character of life by some other means or some other principle? I think a great example of a counter-narrative to Nietzsche's thought could be found in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy. Tolkien, unlike Nietzsche, hated war. The main characters of his story are the hobbits, the little people, both in terms of their actual stature, but also insofar as they are regarded as of no significance by the outside world. They're not remarkable in the manner of the powerful and arrogant elves, or the proud and honorable humans, or the stubborn and warlike dwarves. They are, in many ways, not too dissimilar from your average salt-of-the-earth type rural farmer from Britain, right? The average person. The antagonist of the story, well, I mean, you could say it's Sauron, but really the antagonist of the story is the ring of power. The central drama of the tale is that the characters are routinely faced with the temptation to use and abuse power, or the temptation to seize power, to claim something for themselves to which they have no right, or to exercise force over other beings and dominate them. The ring is the incarnation of this impulse, and the conflict in the story is driven, at least in part, by the ring's constant attempts to seduce its user to it, to seduce all those around the ring, to try and draw upon its power. The nobility of the characters in the story is supposed to be represented by their willingness to fulfill their station in life, to do their duty and carry out that duty as it has fallen to them by destiny, and really because Lord of the Rings takes place in a universe where there's a literal God that has preordained the story. It's very Christian, right? Because it's not that trusting fatalism in the necessity of all things. It's trusting in the ordained fate given to you by a God, in so many words. But people fulfill their station in life, and that's what makes them noble, such that the heroes are people like Aragorn. He's the true king who's hesitant to wield power, but he becomes heroic when he accepts his role as king. The villains are people like Saruman or Denethor, people who sought for power beyond the station they were given. Gandalf even shows mercy and clemency to Saruman in the novels, and Saruman laughs at him and basically alleges that Gandalf himself must simply be power-hungry. He's unable to understand any motivation other than power, and jealous over the prestige and the nobility of Gandalf. And because wizards in Tolkien's novels are sort of like angelic high priests, Gandalf basically defrocks Saruman by breaking his staff and rendering him powerless. It's a very Catholic story, and Tolkien consciously wrote those themes into the work upon revision. The climax of the tale is Frodo, the main character, standing over the pit of fire, faced with the task of giving up power by casting the ring into the fire. And he can't do it. Spoilers on the story that's over, it's like 100 years old at this point, but of course Frodo can't do it because ordinary people don't have the ability to fight their evil, power-seeking impulses by their own willpower. This is part of the Catholic worldview. What saves the world then, is the unseen divine plan playing out, and that Smeagol, who is also present at the climax of the story, and is sort of a Cain-like figure, fights with Frodo and falls into the crack of doom along with the ring during the scuffle. And this is, in some sense, divine intercession, as it's foreshadowed in the novel. It's like by the grace of God, the heroes are allowed to relinquish the lust for power. And with this relinquishing, the forces of warmongering and all the evil in the world is vanquished, and a lasting peace becomes established. So I should say, The Lord of the Rings is perhaps my favorite trilogy of all time. But it is also probably the most anti-Nietzschean story that one could ever write. It's very English in many ways. The common average farmer, the folk of the countryside, the simple person, the unremarkable person is the hero of the tale. Just as all the young men of Britain, for example, were called up to fight during the world wars and did their duty. The hero in battle is reconceptualized, not as this larger-than-life demigod from ancient Greece, but as an average, unremarkable, very English type of person who is called away from his idyllic life by necessity, and like Cincinnatus, goes into battle for the sake of his country and its people, just eager to get back to his crops at the end of all of it, right? It's the self-sacrifice of the ordinary person that is praised, and it is, above all, the relinquishing of power that is treated as the highest good, the highest ideal. The day that may be reached when mankind no longer struggles and claws over one another in order to scale the hierarchy or to exploit and dominate others, the day when life can be lived but without war, that is the paradise at the end of Tolkien's tale. Now, for Tolkien's story to really work, however, there has to be that divine plan, because Tolkien is honest enough to portray the lust for power as something which we do not have the capacity to fight against. Without the grace of God, we return to that old question of where we might find some source of value that is beyond the will to power. That's the great challenge that Nietzsche's philosophy raises, because Tolkien depends on the metaphysics of Christianity. And if we eliminate that metaphysics, we find that its moral claims become difficult, if not impossible, to justify. Without this mythology, all we have is the world as it appears to be. This world need not be a world run by Sauron, because this portrayal of what power-seeking is attributes to power only all of the negatives of life and not the positives, such as, for example, the notion of power is behind even procreation and the love of one's family and children, as Nietzsche might have seen it. So if we don't split the world into two, then we can find a great deal to celebrate about power, because it's only in separating the world into two that we say, oh, well, all the good things are actually by the grace of God, and all the bad things are earthly and human and power-seeking and all of this. And so power becomes not just a destructive force, but a creative one. And so if you were able to bear with me through my explication of J.R.R. Tolkien, to put a fine point on all of it, I just wanted to demonstrate what such a world would look like, or what such a worldview looks like when you oppose yourself to the will to power, and what it required of Tolkien in order to realize that it, in some sense, has to be within the bounds of Christianity and the Christian metaphysics in order for it to make any sense. And, far be it from me to take that away from anyone if that is what they believe in. But Nietzsche thinks that with the death of God, that's not possible for us anymore. And that is the strength, that is the power of using will to power as his orienting principle. And so for us to proceed into the future and take on the task of the revaluation of values, those are the types of questions that we have to wrestle with. If not will to power, then what? If we assert that there is something outside of power upon which to base our values, can it account for everything that the will to power does? And what is our goal here? Is our goal to create more illusory ideals that will never be realized? Or do we actually want to pursue a worldly, grounded philosophy? Do we want to take on that challenge as Nietzsche levies it? In the world we find ourselves in now, we may be alienated by, for example, Nietzsche's take on democracy. But I think, again, that's the wrong way to approach it. We should begin by asking the question, do we really have democracy? Have the people, has the entire populace ever been sovereign? Or do the interests of the people and their representatives begin to diverge the moment that the election is finished and the representative is set above the people? Will the levers of power always separate those from the masses who do not wield them? And if that is the case, then what is it that we are living in now? Is it an oligarchy in content, if democratic in form? And if so, can we ever hope to reach the state of true democracy? And if we can't, are we doing ourselves a disservice by trying to reach it? Has the long peace made us better? Among those who fought in the most horrific of world wars were some of the most disciplined and productive people to have ever lived. Whereas now it seems many agree that we're in a sort of artistic nadir. Perhaps this is more of a reflection of my own generation, the millennials, rather than the Zoomers, but it seems that most of us are yearning for past eras in music and cinema and storytelling. Many people consider past decades to have produced the superior crop of artistic productions, rather than what's coming out currently. We spent centuries trying to create the kind of peace we have now, but we have less faith in our society than ever. And I hardly need to mention all the talk about dividedness and polarization and distrust of one another, especially in America. Why should that be occurring now when, in the 80s and 90s and even in the early 2000s, the perception was that life is better than it's ever been? So I'm not trying to say that things are so bad. I mean, I would agree that our quality of life has substantially improved, but that raises that age-old problem of the paradox of progress and the self-defeat that comes with success. The reason why the Greek saw luxury and safety as dangers and war and strife as a great benefit to those who confronted and endured them. We find that there are many among us who do simply want to submit, as Nietzsche predicted, submit to the facts as they are, and just become a cog in the machine. And they're perfectly happy with that outcome. And they would regard things like war and suffering as inherently evil, and just take it on its face that it's our job as the human race to move beyond those things. We no longer have it in us to assert our own values or individuality in the face of that terrible truth that man is simply this animalistic phenomena within this battleground and play of forces. We come to perceive that nature is immoral, and that we, as her children, are also immoral. Another potential answer to these existential questions of value is to actively and consciously deny our programming, deny our biology. We decide that we no longer wish to change. We no longer wish to continue in this endless cycle of becoming. We want things to stay the way they are. In this analogy, we're like the hobbits in the Shire, a very conservative society where nothing really changes because we have it all figured out. We have invented happiness, figured out how to live in pleasure, but with none of the conflict. And all that there is to do now is to eat, drink, and be merry. For Nietzsche, that is the last man. The last man wants to remain as he is. For the last man, life is just the will to live, and happiness is to have all of your needs met. And accordingly, we stop looking to the horizon and decide that to live a pleasant, content life is enough. What is required for this is, of course, that we give up the pursuit of power. The overman, the beyond man, the ideal that Nietzsche wants us to reach for is instead the transformation of what we are into the next form. And he wants this not because it's a prescriptive statement, but because he sees that this is the character of life, and if we do deny it, it will mean the end for us. We have to keep pushing towards the transcendence of the limitations of the human and the overcoming of what is human if we mean to go on existing at all. That's sort of the irony between, the value system that's simply based on the will to exist is that it actually can't succeed in this. And so the choice between the overman and the last man, it's very famously put to the people in the marketplace by Zarathustra at the very beginning of Nietzsche's novel. And of course, the people ask for the last man. They say, give us this last man, Zarathustra. That's what we want. And this is what the average person will want, because to be average is to be bad at power seeking, and to be risk averse, and to wish for things to remain the same out of that desire for comfort. But if I may disagree with Nietzsche, if ever so slightly, I think the time is dawning where the last man actually looks less palatable to more and more people. That perhaps we're on the cusp of that society-wide revaluation. That in the same way Nietzsche sees a rational, ascetic 17th century overthrown by the sentimental romantic 18th, and then a further turn in the 19th century with its honesty and gloominess, well, then we can say the 20th century was a militarist, irrationalist revolution against this historical approach to life, and now the 21st, really sort of ushered in at the end of that last century, has become this well-managed, analytical, utilitarian era. The information age, as I mentioned, or the pro-felicity age, the era of institutions, a renewed faith in the idealism of democracy, socialism, and universal human value, a new moralism based on these last man ideals in many respects. But if the pattern is to repeat again, perhaps the coming 22nd century will bring us into an era which returns to the earth, or returns us to our nature, and not in the Rousseauian sense, but in the Nietzschean sense. And that far from being some restoration of a Greek aristocracy, what this might mean in practice will be the rejection of a utilitarian assessment of life, the rejection of the last man as an ideal, and a return to self-overcoming as part of a cultural zeitgeist, a rejection of the doctrine of perpetual peace in the face of recurrent wars which always demand an answer and in which all joking has been laid aside, and perhaps an answer to the crisis of values and the defeat of that persistent nihilism that has troubled us during this period of simultaneous decline and experimentation. Perhaps the time has come for a new epoch, and quite to the disappointment of someone like Steven Pinker, whose thoroughly utilitarian analysis of how the world has gotten better dissatisfies so many of us now, because Pinker wishes for the Enlightenment now, which he really should have said Enlightenment forever. So this thing should stay the same way forever, always the same values. We have it figured out already. Perhaps it's time to overcome the Enlightenment, not to destroy or reject it, but to sublate it and transition into a new era of European or Western civilization. It's impossible to say what form such a transformation would take, but rather than concerning ourselves with predicting all the particulars of what will play out in actual history, what Nietzsche invites us to do is to chart the way forward philosophically, and to do so, he calls upon the philosophers of the future, the free spirits that can finally arrive in the era that now necessitates them, this time of upheaval and confusion. And again, to be free here means to be accepting of one's own nature as a human being, as a child of nature in the ever-unfolding process of evolution, to be accepting of the animalian instincts and motivations in our own hearts, and at the same time striving to be free of things like revenge and envy and hatred. We're not ashamed of these things when we find them within us, but we are unified in our ideas about the world and in our feelings and our actions. That is the type of person that the free spirit, Nietzsche hopes the free spirit could be, and it's simply to be accepting of the world and accepting of themselves and live with that trusting fatalism of Goethe. That is freedom. Only those who are free in that manner are going to be able to navigate this period of values creation. And so that's the task set before ourselves, to free ourselves, to see necessity in all things, to comprehend all phenomena, all moments as interconnected, to see every human as a natural phenomenon and therefore something innocent, to redeem the world here meaning the material world of nature, without appeal to a spiritual world, without the divine plan of a God, to nevertheless redeem the world, call it good and innocent, at least as far as we are concerned. And so this is Nietzsche's task. It manifests in the form of his work in morality and metaphysics and art, and even here in politics. The challenge is to accept the world without recourse to comforting illusions. That's what he wants in the political realm, as in every other dimension of his thought, because that will, somewhat paradoxically, free us to accept what the will to power is in the political sense of this, constant battle and challenge and exploitation and domination, It sounds tyrannical, but it's actually freeing. The sense of acceptance that he offers us is an alternative to condemning the world and living in resentment of it, which Nietzsche believes is always demanded by the moralistic interpretations of life. Now, is there a moralistic interpretation of life that manages to avoid this sense of condemnation? Again, that's another example of a question that might be raised by studying Nietzsche's politics, which it doesn't have to do with having to say yes or no to Nietzsche's own political opinions. It's an entry point for us into the deepest matters of value. That's what Nietzsche is giving us with his task. It allows us to vivisect our own values and explain to ourselves why we believe what we believe, and represent to ourselves the logical conclusions of what we believe by way of comparison. The relevant contrast that we have invoked throughout the season is that of Thucydides versus Plato. Thucydides sees necessity in everything and sees reason in such necessity, whereas reason for Plato is the basis of a morality, and everything about human society and its culture is condemned as inadequate when assessed according to the demands of reason. Thucydides, therefore, stands for realism, Plato for idealism, and Nietzsche is forever in the realist camp. And so, realism is freedom. That's another way to put the argument. It frees you from this ersatz moral assessment of your own actions and the actions of others, this coloring that's added onto the world that is constantly there and constantly nagging at your mind and constantly demanding its satisfaction, right? That you can't simply evaluate a political situation realistically. You have to bring to bear this moral judgment upon it, and then either affirm or condemn it, morally speaking. That's what Nietzsche wants to free you from, and it doesn't mean you're unable to act. It means instead that your actions will never be carried out unrealistically or in futility. You'll be free from those judgments passed upon yourself, or from the burden of having to pass moral judgment on the world or on other individuals. The world is no longer condemned, it just is. And so I don't know how helpful I've been in giving this summary of Nietzsche's politics and his political project, but I hope that some of you have gotten something out of it, as I have, by allowing ourselves the experiment of raising these questions, of clashing Nietzsche's values against our modern values and asking ourselves what meaning we can derive from that clash, asking ourselves what goal we're really seeking in politics and what valuations that goal is based on, and what it would mean to change those valuations. And it's that kind of experimentalism that is part and parcel with being a free spirit, and why Nietzsche says a name for the philosophers of the future will be experimenters or tempters and attempters. He makes that coinage in Beyond Good and Evil, aphorism number 42. I want to look at the very next one, number 43, the aphorism right after he names the philosophers of the future as experimenters. Nietzsche writes this, quote, "Will they be friends of truth, these coming philosophers? Very probably, for all philosophers hitherto have loved their truths. But assuredly they will not be dogmatists. It must be contrary to their pride and also contrary to their taste that their truth should still be truth for everyone, that which has hitherto been the secret wish and ultimate purpose of all dogmatic efforts. My opinion is my opinion. Another person has not easily a right to it. Such a philosopher of the future will say, perhaps. One must renounce the bad taste of wishing to agree with many people. Good is no longer good when one's neighbor takes it into his mouth. And how could there be a common good? The expression contradicts itself. That which can be common is always of small value. In the end, things must be as they are and have always been. The great things remain for the great, the abysses for the profound, the delicacies and thrills for the refined, and to sum up shortly, everything rare for the rare." End quote. We've talked about Nietzsche's conception of truth many times on this show, that he holds that relative view of truth rather than the absolute one. But what I would like to draw attention to in this passage is how the view of truth that he puts forward is one which runs contrary to the common ideas about truth in another important way, in that it is better for the majority not to know the truth or not to pursue the truth, or that there are truths which it is better for you to hold on to as your own and not attempt to proselytize to others. That we should keep our truths to ourselves and even cherish our own distinctive truths as if they were our own property in some sense. That someone can only truly believe in the truths that he has a right to, which means that truth is not something that can be spread as somebody on a crusade. I've learned from a lot of the feedback I've gotten on this podcast that some people out there really wish that I was more of a preacher and either gave my own personal opinion or really tried to take on the task of interpreting Nietzsche for you and telling you how to think and taking a stand and saying, yes, Nietzsche is correct and you should believe this, right? This is so against my inclination in that I don't think it's my place to tell you how to feel. And I don't think I could, even if I tried. I'm not the one to say what is good for you or what you should believe. Occasionally people do ask me for advice and things like that on the Q&A episodes, and I'll give it gladly. But my goal is not to convert people to an ideology or tell them how to feel and think. And I would like to think that it's because I am of a kind with Nietzsche on this point. Your truths are yours, and mine are mine. And you have to fight your own battles to determine which of your truths are worth keeping and which should be discarded and which new ones you have a right to possess. I cannot give you any truths. You have to find them. And so the philosopher of the future is a perspectivist. They perceive the irreducibility of one's perspective in determining how to value and what to value. This acceptance of the mutual exclusivity of competing perspectives, it's part of that acceptance of the world. The acceptance that there is a multiplicity of forces battling to impose what they value, and we apply this as much to ourselves as to the world at large. In the aphorism after this one, in 44, Nietzsche continues his description of the philosopher of the future. It's a long section, and it concludes Book 2 of Beyond Good and Evil. I love this section because, even as I have attempted to make palatable the very harsh aspects of Nietzsche's political ideas, he once again confronts us with the brutal reality of them in this passage. But he does it again as a temptation, in the sense that he is appealing to those of us who like an intellectual challenge, who like strange, wicked, questionable questions, and who are willing to venture into terrifying or dangerous territory in our philosophical wandering. So, this is from section 44, quote, "Need I say expressly after all this that they will be free, very free spirits, these philosophers of the future, as certainly also they will not be merely free spirits, but something more, higher, greater, and fundamentally different, which does not wish to be misunderstood and mistaken. But while I say this, I feel under obligation almost as much to them as to ourselves, we free spirits who are their heralds and forerunners, to sweep away from ourselves altogether a stupid old prejudice and misunderstanding, which, like a fog, has too long made the conception of free spirit obscure. In every country of Europe, and the same in America, there is at present something which makes an abuse of this name, a very narrow, prepossessed, enchained class of spirits, who desire almost the opposite of what our intentions and instincts prompt, not to mention that in respect to the new philosophers who are appearing, they must still be more closed windows and bolted doors. Briefly and regrettably, they belong to the levelers, these wrongly named free spirits, as glib-tongued and scribe-fingered slaves of the democratic taste and its modern ideas. All of them, men without solitude, without personal solitude, blunt, honest fellows to whom neither courage nor honorable conduct ought to be denied, only they are not free, and are ludicrously superficial, especially in their innate partiality for seeing the cause of almost all human misery and failure in the old forms in which society has hitherto existed, a notion which happily inverts the truth entirely. What they would fain attain with all their strength is the universal green meadow happiness of the herd, together with security, safety, comfort, the alleviation of life for everyone. Their two most frequently chanted songs and doctrines are called equality of rights and sympathy with all sufferers, and suffering itself is looked upon by them as something which must be done away with." End quote. So the free spirit is not the free thinker in the sense of someone who is convinced merely of modern ideas which are now popular and against traditional forms and ideas. That's the perversion of the idea, right? It's like, oh, we've freed ourselves from the old traditional ideas and now we're free. But he's simply pointing out that the modern ideas are just as much of an imposition upon the kind of, actually free self-legislated ideas that would come from somebody who is able to think in solitude. He makes an interesting criticism of this person in that they see the cause of all misery as resulting from those mistakes or the malicious actions of past generations, of old societal forms. That progress is the deliverance from the unjust social arrangements that were artificially imposed on mankind by society. This is, in so many words, the Rousseauian view, at least in part. The free spirit, on the other hand, as Nietzsche sees him, sees this as an inversion of the truth, insofar as civilization, in fact, represented a deliverance from the oppression of living in the state of nature. That civilization was a hard-won state of comfort and luxury, and that there's no such thing as the equality of rights or of a natural pity in the state of nature. The realization that nature is brutal, oppressive, and unequal. And as a matter of fact, even though we never escape the state of nature, civilization represented an innovation, an improvement on this, because at least we can reap the fruits of culture, of the arts and sciences. These were hard-fought victories. This was the Greek Apollinian perception that they had to overthrow titans and slay monsters in order to establish the polis, right? And so what the utilitarian modern person does is pursue the ending of all suffering. This is what they would fain attain with all their strength. And whether we find that desirable or not, Nietzsche thinks it's impossible, and it would simply lead to suffering of a different kind. But he brings forth his even more terrifying challenge to this idea in the following lines. Quote, "We opposite ones, however, who have opened our eye and conscience to the question how and where the plant man has hitherto grown most vigorously, believe that this has always taken place under the opposite conditions. That for this end the dangerousness of his situation has to be increased enormously, his inventive faculty and dissembling power, his spirit had to develop into subtlety and daring under long oppression and compulsion, and that his will to life had to be increased to the unconditioned will to power. We believe that severity, violence, slavery, danger in the street and in the heart, secrecy, stoicism, tempters' art and devilry of every kind, that everything wicked, terrible, tyrannical, predatory, and serpentine in man serves as well for the elevation of the human species as its opposite. We do not even say enough when we say only this much, and in any case we find ourselves here, both with our speech and our silence, at the other extreme of all modern ideology and gregarious desirability, as their antipodes perhaps. What wonder that we free spirits are not exactly the most communicative spirits, that we do not wish to betray in every respect what a spirit can free itself from, and where perhaps it will then be driven. And as to the import of the dangerous formula beyond good and evil, with which we at least avoid confusion, we are something else than the libre penseurs, liben pensatori, free thinkers, and whatever these honest advocates of modern ideas like to call themselves." End quote. That's why the free spirit's truths can't be easily communicated, because what the free spirit believes about the realities of human nature are so repulsive to the populace at large that they will always prefer to put their faith in some illusion, some moral fiction about the world, or a moral fiction about humanity and the project of civilization. They'll always try and look for what Tolkien yearned for, right? The destruction of power-seeking and the advent of peace. Nietzsche says that such an attitude is antipodal to his philosopher of the future. It's opposite. The philosophers of the future, the true free spirits, they are opposite types of people from how the way the term free spirit is usually used. And he says that they think mankind has best improved under opposite conditions to those of the comfort and safety sought after by the utilitarians. And so the free spirit has to exist in this kind of intellectual and moral solitude because his ideas do not produce pleasure. but displeasure, which means they will almost always perish among the more pleasurable ideas espoused by the many. And so we'll go back and finish the passage. Quote, "Having been at home, or at least guests in many realms of the spirit, having escaped again and again from the gloomy, agreeable nooks in which preferences and prejudices, youth, origin, and the accident of men and books, or even the weariness of travel seem to confine us, full of malice against the seductions of dependency which he concealed in honors, money, positions, or exaltations of the senses, grateful even for distress and the vicissitudes of illness, because they always free us from some rule, and its prejudice, grateful to the god, devil, sheep, and worm in us, inquisitive to a fault, investigators to the point of cruelty, with unhesitating fingers for the intangible, with teeth and stomachs for the most indigestible, ready for any business that requires sagacity and acute senses, ready for every adventure, owing to an excess of, quote, free will, with anterior and posterior souls, into the ultimate intentions of which it is difficult to pry, with foregrounds and backgrounds, to the end of which no foot may run, hidden ones under the mantles of light, appropriators, although we resemble heirs and spendthrifts, arrangers and collectors from morning till night, misers of our wealth and our full-crammed drawers, economical in learning and forgetting, inventive in scheming, sometimes proud of tables of categories, sometimes pedants, sometimes night owls of work even in full day, yea, if necessary, even scarecrows. And it is necessary nowadays, that is to say, inasmuch as we are the born, sworn, jealous friends of solitude, of our own profoundest midnight and midday solitude. Such kind of men are we free spirits, and perhaps you are also something of the same kind, you coming ones, you new philosophers." End quote. So that last part of the passage was just one run-on sentence. It's really just a prose poem that's inserted into the text. I mean, Nietzsche has that habit of the philosophical insights just sort of blurring into a prose poem at the end of especially at the last section of a book, right? There's so much of Nietzsche in that passage, though, at the end. The idea of having fought against illness and the weariness of travel and having rejected money and honors, right? The way he rejected his position within academia and sought out solitude. This passage, like all of his work, is in some sense his confession about himself and a poetic expression of the depths of his own soul. He sees the entire cosmic drama within himself. He sees himself as the herald and forerunner of this new generation who will finish his work, and he ascribes all these traits that he wishes the new generation to embody. But ultimately, Nietzsche, it must be said, is thinking in terms of the conditions that he experienced in his own century, and perhaps the ones he predicted in the century to come. Now that we're past all that, it's only a matter of opinion, or at best an educated guess, as to how Nietzsche might describe the philosopher of the future if he were to know what we know now. But if we take seriously that most central aspect that he includes, that of freedom, of self-determination, self-legislating, being opposite and an antipode to the popular ideas all around you, seeking solitude and saying, my truths are my truths and no one else has a right to them, we return to that farewell at the end of the first book of Zarathustra. This is my way, where is yours? So as a final thought, I think Nietzsche's most sincere and profound message, here as in all the rest of his work, is to discover which truths you have the right to, which is another way of saying, become who you are. It's a little less vague of a formulation of the same idea. It doesn't simply mean to hold on to the truths that sound most agreeable to you, because the truths that you have a right to may in fact be terrible or disturbing. What he means is to affirm the truths that you can live out and act out in your life. It means to be true to yourself and honest about what is inside you, and whether your words and beliefs cohere with your actions and your character, whether you have a unity of inside and outside, whether you're able to accept the tension within your heart and harness it to shoot for the goals that you can aim for, and that only you can aim for. This is his challenge to us politically, to remain true to the earth, to accept humankind for what we are. And it's his challenge to us on the individual level as well, to accept ourselves for what we are, to not let our thoughts be guided or coerced by the voice of the collective inside of our heads, but instead allow ourselves to pursue questions that lead into the forbidden country. Remember that quotation, the second ever episode that we did on the podcast, where we discussed Nietzsche's quotation in Ecce Homo, that philosophy is something he understands as wandering in forbidden country, daring to venture into the intellectual and moral territory upon which the community has set its ban. That's what we've done for this season. And even if you agree with none of what Nietzsche has argued, as Walter Kaufmann said, his disagreements with Nietzsche politically are legion. By even raising the questions that he has and daring to inhabit his perspective and set it against the modern as a contrast, we have undertaken such a journey into that forbidden country. We have made the experiment, and whatever new values you may forge out of it will be those only you have a right to. And I hope that Nietzsche, if nothing else, could be your midwife. Ladies and gentlemen, the last episode of Season 3 is officially over. The politics season is done, and in a short while, we'll begin another book analysis. It's time to go beyond good and evil, right? I'm very excited to revisit and walk through that book with all of you. There have been many attempts at interpreting this work. Hopefully mine will add something to the cacophony of voices that some of you find valuable. So that's going to be our book club analysis. Even though we've covered a lot of material from Beyond Good and Evil throughout the podcast, I'm going to attempt a completionist reading of it section by section. As a final word, the podcast has now passed 10,000 subscribers on YouTube and 30,000 followers on Spotify, and growing. Every time we hit a milestone like this, I say I can't believe it, and I think I'm still in disbelief. All I can say then is thank you, a very special thank you to everyone who's listened, subscribed, hit the like button on a YouTube video, shared the show, or given to the Patreon. You have no idea what it means to me and how surreal it is that I have touched the lives of so many people. It's a feeling that's humbling and gratifying all at the same time, and I just want to express deepest love to all of you on all of your journeys. I hope you all find your way. I don't know about you, but I'm more than ready for a new philosophical era, for the sublation of the current era. The time is noon, and the days of the philosophers of the future have now come. I'm glad to share these days with all of you. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.